Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar about the future of work and assessing the long-term impacts of COVID-19 in the workplace. I'm Rhoda McVeigh. I'm the Director of Consulting Services for KMA Human Resources Consulting. KMA Human Resources Consulting works with successful, growing businesses throughout New England. We're your partner for managing and growing your most valuable resource, your people. So just a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce Michael, who's with me today. We welcome and encourage your questions throughout. You can type them into the chat and we'll try and get to them as they come up while we're talking, and we'll try and leave a little bit of time at the end of the hour to answer questions as well. So joining me today is Michael Messerschmidt, attorney with the Preti Flaherty, Portland, Maine office. Michael is a Preti partner and chair of the firm's employment law group. He regularly advises clients on all aspects of employment law. Preti Flaherty is a deliberately different law firm of 100 attorneys with 4 New England locations and an office in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for being with us today, Michael.
Thank you, Rhoda. And good afternoon, everyone. When Rhoda and I first talked about this topic, you can see that we're both eternal optimists, because we felt that if we were speaking in December, and we were thinking that, well, by March, we'll have a better idea of what the long-term impacts of COVID-19 in the workplace are. And so here we are, at least, just about 3 months later, still wondering what those long-term impacts are, but we're going to take our best stab at it today.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the questions, because we have some really good ones today, I think. So, Michael, to begin with, what do you think are some of the lessons learned from the pandemic that employers should think about incorporating into planning for future such events and future in general?
Well, let's go to our first slide, and that'll, I think, give us an overview of how we're going to address that question today and in the next hour. And in that, what is the workplace going to look like in the future? The biggest question is going to be, is remote work here to stay? And that's what we'll talk about first. And then we'll go on to the obvious issue with even fewer answers, is how will political considerations change the relationship between employers and employees, and how has COVID-19 impacted that? And those are the long-term things that we were hoping to really zero in on today. And yet, the second part of what we're talking about today is, how do we even get there? And that is, how do we handle returning to the office? So we'll talk about shaping vaccination policies and incentives, obligations regarding accommodations requests, and future pandemic planning. So, the key question is, how are people going to get back to work? And what is it going to look like when we are, as we say, back? This is the overriding question. It affects lots of industries, but not all. A lot of direct client contact, customer contact industries may look fairly similar when and if we're back. Certainly, white collar office work, I think, is going to change very, very significantly. So why don't we go to our next slide also, which talks about the ultimate question, which is remote work here to stay? So Rhoda found us this very effective survey data, which I think really illustrates, where we are, at least at the time of this fairly recent survey. And that is that a whole lot of people actually enjoy working remotely, most of whom say it's actually had a positive impact on their work-life balance. More than half feel that they've been more productive, and nearly half say it hasn't taken a toll on their mental health. Those are all the good things about it. 81% of working professionals enjoy working remotely. So those are the good things about remote work. But will that remain? Now, obviously, there's always the issue of how connected we are to one another at work. And, many of us have tried Zoom cocktail hours and other social gatherings online to keep people connected. But after a year of that, are we dealing with fatigue on that as well? Just COVID fatigue, Zoom fatigue? Are we at the point where we're really itching to get back and be with people and be with our colleagues? And so there's that tension going on. But there have been enough positive things about remote work that I think it's clear it's going to stay in some form or other. Let's take a peek at our next slide. And this is the next question, Rhoda, which is not just how do you feel about what you've been doing, how do you feel about going back?
Right.
So most companies obviously intend to bring people back, and people expect to be brought back to some kind of on-site work. But 61% say they want to be able to work remotely indefinitely, at least for part of the time. And a pretty stunning number, nearly a third say they'd quit if they weren't allowed to continue remote at least part of the time. So then we look to the survey to see, well, how often do people want to be back? And so I think, you know, we have the makings of the hybrid model. People would like the opportunity to work part of the week at home, part of the week in the office. And how are we going to make that happen? I think that's going to be part of our planning. But this hasn't been a short-term project now. It's been a year, and I think, while we may have hoped back in December when we just had news of a new vaccine that maybe in 3-4 months we'd be back, but we're obviously we're not there yet. With variants, we're concerned that we may not be as close as we would like to be. So remote work is here to stay. That doesn't mean that your company or organization can't decide it's not effective for you. But I'd say generally in most businesses, some form of remote work is going to stay.
So Michael, what rights do both employers and employees have with making that decision on who gets to work remotely, who needs to come back to the workplace? How does that get figured out?
Well, ultimately, it's the company's call. It's the employer's call. You've got a business or a service to run, and it's your determination. Legally, you certainly have the right to make people come back to work eventually. You also have an obligation to provide them with a safe workplace. And so we have that tension. When will it be safe? When can we insist that everybody come back? And what's the effect of making everybody come back? What if this 29% of people who say they quit if they couldn't work remotely? How real is that number? Is that an idle threat or is that a real threat? And do you really want to find out? I think it may be, Rhoda, I think it's going to be a market consideration. I think if people are going to walk and go to an employer who gives them a little bit more flexibility, particularly younger employees, I think that's going to figure into our calculations. Bottom line is that we have to get the work done. And if people can't do it efficiently remotely, then we're under no obligation to have them do so. So I think it's a business decision.
Fair enough. So with the political considerations that we're seeing and so forth as well, you know, we're starting to hear a lot more around like unionization and the administration and so forth. What are those implications for employers?
Yeah, let's move on to our next slide. So all employers need to be aware of the potential issue of unionization. Now, I think it is more likely that we may see some activity in certain industries. I think healthcare is one that should be concerned. Some service industries, you know, perhaps hotel industries, restaurant industries, and manufacturing always. we haven't seen a lot of unionization in the private sector in the Northeast, and in Maine and New Hampshire in particular, there has not been a lot of it, and the number of unionized workplaces has declined in recent years. Last year, however, union membership in Maine grew pretty significantly. And if you had been listening to President Biden in almost every one of his speeches, these four words, good paying union jobs, always seems to make it into his lexicon. So does that mean it's actually going to happen? Not necessarily. But the president is certainly signaling that he's not uncomfortable with more businesses becoming unionized. He will have opportunities to name members to the National Labor Relations Board. We'll have a different Department of Labor than under the previous administration. And I think the administration is simply going to be friendlier towards unions. And so we may see more activity in that regard. I think the general political consideration is not necessarily that the country is moving left, but I do think the issue of income disparity and disparity between the haves and have-nots has certainly raised feelings of real insecurity. We see a populist movement on the right, we see populists on the left, and what they may have in common is that there are a lot of people working lower pay jobs who feel they're not getting their share of the successful life in America. So I think unionization is something that every employer should be aware of as a possibility and sensitive to. You know, that doesn't mean you need to panic, and it doesn't mean you need to overreact. And frankly, I think unionization is frequently not about the money, but it's about how people feel they're being treated. And so this is really a prime opportunity for employers to make sure that their employees do feel appreciated. I think that the circumstances of the pandemic have been particularly difficult for everyone, for businesses and for employees and for families. And to the extent that employers have been empathetic to the circumstances of their employees, whether it is caring for sick relatives or kids home from school and mom and dad having to figure out how to handle the first graders' homework and at the same time trying to get their work done remotely, this has been a difficult time. So I think unionization is a threat, and I think it's more important than ever for companies and HR professionals in particular to have your ears close to the ground and be empathetic towards the situation and the difficulties that employees may be facing. So
yeah, and we talked at the last webinar also, Michael, that that employers really need to have a dialogue with their employees and not just issue some flat assertion. Everyone will be back on this date or else, and find out what their needs are and try and align them with the company needs to make it a win-win for everyone. So to your point, this is the time to continue to maintain that empathy and realize that people are still struggling and needing to work together to figure out the best road forward, particularly if they want to hang on to their talented people.
Right. So some people are very happy, obviously, working remotely, and others are feeling very isolated. So I think it's difficult. I mean, we see the survey numbers that show a lot of people have fared pretty well working remotely, but it's not 100%. And we don't know just how difficult it has been for the people who say this isn't working out for me. We're not quite sure just how hard it has been on some families, and I think we really need to keep that in mind. We're going to come out of this at some point, but we want to come out of it with our businesses intact and our workforces intact. Let's move on to another slide, which is also, I think, a political consideration, and that's the minimum wage.
Yeah. Yeah, what are you hearing about minimum wage in terms of those implications on businesses and $15 minimum? And there's a lot of discussions, certainly in the HR community, if not the financial community as well.
Right. So this was a big issue in the election last year. And again, this is a situation that's certainly exasperated by the pandemic. We had a lot of states that have raised their state minimum wage effective January of 2021. I think the number may have been nearly 20 states raised their state minimum wage. But we do see nationally, we're all over the map. And I don't think any state is yet at $15 an hour. So $15 an hour was a theme within the Democratic Party campaign. And it's certainly something that's still being pushed in the House of Representatives. I think we're going to see some increase in the federal minimum wage. I don't think we're going to see 15. I don't know what it's going to be, but whatever it is, it's going to be phased in. I think the problem that most of us recognize is that $7.25 an hour is a federal minimum. That may be fine for the teenager working at that rate, but for a single mom with a couple kids working 40 hours a week at $7.25, it's difficult to get out of poverty. And as a policy matter, I suspect the country would rather have people who are working full-time not be under the poverty level. So we're going to be seeing that kind of a push. Obviously, a number of states enacted it on a state level. They weren't all blue states. Some of those were red states. And so, there's a push for it. The $7.25 is mostly, as you can see, it's in a lot of the southern states. And they've certainly been reluctant to push it up. But if you look at the Northeast, you also see that the minimum wage is $7.25 in New Hampshire and in Pennsylvania, really surprisingly. I'm not sure that's the effective minimum wage, just because market considerations. New Hampshire has obviously had a strong economy for a number of years, and I think we suspect that the market has driven the actual minimum wage higher than that. But still, legally and effectively, it's $7.25. I think Portland's referendum last fall, I thought was particularly shocking. So for those of you who are not Portland area employers, the city of Portland had a minimum wage referendum that not only increased it from the then state level of $12 an hour, eventually to 15, but it also included a hazard pay effective overtime provision, and the intent of it was to raise the basic minimum wage in Portland for someone working physically within the city boundaries to $18 an hour, time and a half of 12. Effective 30 days from the referendum, which would have been in early December. And so this was an enormous increase in the minimum wage from 12 to 18. It is being challenged in court thus far successfully, in terms, at least in the most recent court order, that it would not go into effect until January of 22. And hopefully by that time, we're no longer in a state or community hazard situation where the overtime provision would even be required. But what was particularly startling about this referendum is that Portland is obviously a very liberal city, and we can't really compare it fairly to a lot of other communities in Maine or New Hampshire. But still, it won with about, I think, 63% of the vote. And that is just startling. And I think it's more than it just being a liberal city. I think there is some tremendous sympathy for people at the lower end of the wage spectrum. And I think there is sympathy and empathy for those people who actually have to physically go into their offices or workplaces every day. That referendum, I think we should consider a red flag that we're going to be seeing pushes like this elsewhere. Probably not as extreme as that. And this one, you know, from most employers' perspective, was so extreme as to just be unreasonable. Again, it's sort of a populist overreaction to a problem that government, you know, probably hasn't been able to address very effectively. So we'll be seeing more of those kinds of efforts in New England and elsewhere. And assuming the federal government is not able to increase the minimum wage by very much with this Congress, I think we may see more and more local action, either in cities or in other states in the Northeast. So it's an issue out there. And once again, it's the haves and the have-nots. And I think it's part of a populist movement on the left and the right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. What workplace policies then, Michael, do you think companies should have updated by now or should be looking to update, you know, as we bring people back and, you know, we take a look at things that have changed as a result of this last year and the pandemic?
Well, let's talk about how we get people back. So I think the first issue that we're going to be looking at is vaccination. That seems to be, that's
Right.
the path to get people back. This, of course, is not, this is an immediate term issue. This is not the long-term issue that we were hoping we would be able to start addressing. But I think, you know, vaccination is where we're going to start. And so these are the issues. You know, the first one is mandating vaccinations. So I think the legal rule, the one that we should all understand, is that employers do have a right to mandate its employees be vaccinated before they return to the workplace. And we have the right to mandate that they come back to the workplace. However, and of course, this is a huge however, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. For instance, you know, we're in an at-will state, and that means that you have the right to fire employees for any non-illegal reason. Just because you can fire them doesn't mean you should. And so mandating vaccines is kind of the same thing. You may reach a situation where in your business, it is essential. I have not heard of many places mandating it yet. And hopefully we don't have to. There are obvious downsides to mandating it. And I can't recommend that we mandate it, even though we'd probably all be safer if everybody were vaccinated before they return. So a mandate is limited legally if there's an ADA concern. There's a medical condition that inhibits the employee from being vaccinated, or if there's a religious reason. The religion ones are a little tougher to figure out, but it may well be something that has to be accommodated, and that accommodation doesn't necessarily mean they can't be back at work, but they would have to be probably physically accommodated. But so the question of mandating vaccines, I think, is sometimes the first question we have. In some organizations, it's simply unsafe for us not to have vaccinated people, and so you can certainly mandate it for people in certain positions, but you may have to accommodate them. You may have to accommodate them if they have an ADA or a religion reason. Otherwise, you don't have a legal obligation, as I see it, to accommodate them. Mere fear of vaccination or philosophical objection, or for instance, I'm just not ready. There was a case in New York involving a waitress at a Brooklyn restaurant who wasn't opposed to being vaccinated when her employer indicated indicated all would be required to. But she did say she had concerns because of her age. She was of childbearing age and hadn't decided yet. But the employer let her go, and she really didn't have any legal recourse. You know, hopefully she'll find other work, and I think the employer would be happy to have her back. But that particular employer did mandate vaccination for all restaurant employees. Not aware of a lot of employers who have done that similarly in Maine or New Hampshire, but we may be hearing more about them.
So it's okay for employers to require like proof that they got vaccinated though, so they can bring them back to work? Is that okay?
We haven't had any really clear guidance on that, because we do wonder whether or not that's going to implicate other medical disclosures.
Right.
We may see more of that, because we may, once travel opens up, it could be that we're going to need to provide proof of vaccination to travel to certain countries. I don't think we've progressed that far in the States yet. And I think we're all a little uncomfortable with the whole idea of the proof of vaccination, what it's going to look like. I think that's an issue that's out there. I think the EEOC is going to weigh in at some point. I think the medical people will probably help us as well. I don't think we're there yet. And I'm concerned about the inquiries. So I think all of those go along with proof of vaccination and mandating vaccination.
Sure. Yeah. And so you have a bullet point here about offering incentives. There's some discussion in the HR community about the legality of offering people bonus pay to get vaccinated, or paid time off to go get vaccinated. There's some legal concerns around that employees should understand.
Well, there's some potential discrimination claims if you cannot receive the vaccine but want and would like to get the incentive. I don't think those are huge barriers to incentive programs. I think both the EEOC and the CDC are really putting a lot of burden on the employers to encourage people to get vaccinated without requiring it. But, we're all being encouraged to send out positive messages to our employees and encouraging them to be vaccinated. So I think generally incentives are going to be a good idea. They're not without potential pitfalls, but the easiest ones are give people time off. If they have an appointment to get a vaccine, for gosh sakes, let them go. Give them time off or give them paid time off to do it. Small gifts, small cash payments, small bonus payments, all seem to be okay. The one thing that the one more prominent thing I think we need to be careful of is with hourly employees. I think these bonuses probably figure into the regular rate of pay for overtime calculations. So if you have hourly people who are getting overtime during the weeks that they're receiving this bonus payment, you're likely looking at recalculating the regular rate of pay for overtime purposes.
Mm-hmm.
But that and the potential discrimination against someone who has a religious or ADA objection to being vaccinated. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why we don't want these bonuses to be so dramatic, so that it's not so significant that you're really treating someone badly by withholding this bonus or the time off to get vaccinated, as opposed to someone who doesn't get time off because they're not getting vaccinated. So I think incentives are not a terrible idea at all. I think workplaces are probably all better off if you have more vaccinated people. So to that extent, it's not like we've had to do this before, but I think the incentives are not a bad idea. I mean, we've certainly had a lot of studies showing large numbers of people do not wish to be vaccinated. either because they're fearful of this one or because they don't want any vaccines, or whatever. And we're also told that we're not going to achieve any kind of herd immunity unless we have a really high percentage of the population vaccinated. So I'd say as a public service, we should probably be encouraging as many people as possible to get vaccinated. And if it takes incentives to do that, it probably makes it easier for us to bring our people back to work.
Right, right. So what should a company strategy be around vaccination and handling the unvaccinated, that kind of thing? Should they adapt a strategy?
Well, I think we have to consider that. It may not be at the forefront yet, but hopefully in a couple of months, we'll have enough vaccinated people so that the number who are unvaccinated really becomes something that we need to deal with. So if we're dealing with an ADA case, or we're dealing with someone with a religious objection, then we use the normal ADA rules or religious rules to accommodate them, whether it be in their schedule or their workstation, or if necessary, even a leave of absence. We obviously are going to need to know more about the effect of the vaccine in terms of how transmissible is the disease from those who have been vaccinated. All of those things are going to affect how we bring people back and how we bring them back safely. This restaurant in Brooklyn handled the unvaccinated by letting them go. If in fact we're going to be looking at significant numbers of people who won't or can't be vaccinated, I'm not so sure that's going to be practical. You can certainly accommodate people by moving them to different jobs. If for instance, you have client contact, customer contact, direct interaction, that really necessitates, in our view, having people vaccinated. Maybe those people end up working remotely. And maybe that starts figuring into, is the remote workforce the people who won't be vaccinated? Do we only bring back those who are? It may be a factor in when we assess who gets to work remotely and who doesn't. But there's no broad legal right. If you do not have an ADA issue or a religious issue, it's a difficult argument for an employee to make that I can't and I won't.
No. Yeah. So bringing people back to work then, vaccinated or not, we're hearing that they should still practice social distancing and mask wearing and so forth in the workplace. Is that something also that employers are going to be held accountable for in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to change. I mean, that's going to be a long-term issue. Long-term being, I suspect, for some months after we are back. Those issues aren't going to change. We may be back in the workplace, but we may still have the same masking requirements that we have when we're bringing people back on a limited basis right now. We may still be setting up our workstations and work pathways to maintain social distancing. We're obviously still going to have, hand sanitizers all over the place. I mean, some things we can say this looks like it's going to be, intermediate or even long term. And OSHA is. We may see a new OSHA also. This may also be a political consideration. OSHA may be more active in enforcement under a Biden administration than it was under the previous administration. But even OSHA, in terms of the guidance that they're giving us during the pandemic, is still just sort of reminding us that we have a general duty to provide a safe workplace without giving us a whole lot of specifics. But they are reminding us that no matter what, we have an obligation to our workforce to give them a safe place to work. And so I think the OSHA is going to look to the CDC, and we're going to be maintaining those kinds of safe workplace practices. Mask wearing, physical distancing, signage, remote work, travel restrictions. I think Bill Gates said that he thinks 50% of business travel is going to go away after the pandemic. He might not be wrong about that. You know, business travel could really suffer. And companies may decide that, you know, these remote meetings are a lot more effective and cost effective. So, you know, that may be something that really changes. But that would certainly seem to be part of our concerns in complying with OSHA and a safe workplace, just not letting people travel as much. Mm-hmm. So I think those are the kinds of policies we need to be thinking about that relate, you know, to vaccination.
And employers can require employees to wear masks in the workplace as part of the dress code, right? Part of your ability to be able to come into the building.
Right. I mean, we're having constitutional challenges to the governor and you know, the actions of the state in terms of requiring it in public establishments, but certainly a private business has the right to impose whatever rules it wants on its employees and on its customers. And if masking is part of that, then that may very well be what we have to do for a while. So, and I suspect it will continue that way for some months. Now, hopefully not indefinitely, but I think, you know, we've been getting used to wearing masks, and I think we will for a while longer. And I think that will certainly be part of company policies.
Probably so. Michael, we have a question that's come in here that says, is it okay for HR to share with managers who has or has not been vaccinated? And this is being asked by somebody that's a provider of residential services for adults with disabilities, invisible disabilities.
I think that's a difficult question. And so this would be them, I assume, advising the managers who of their subordinate staff have been vaccinated. If we are mandating all be vaccinated before they can perform certain functions in terms of providing direct services to the person served, I would say in that sense, we probably would want to let them know if it's a mandate. We're treading into privacy issues here.
Right.
But if we have determined that it is an essential job requirement, both for the family of the person served, we want to make sure that the person in their, let's say, group home setting or whatever is vaccinated or not. We're certainly treading on a tough area, but if we've already made the decision that we're mandating all of our direct care people be vaccinated or be accommodated by working elsewhere, then I think it's critical for a manager to know who's being scheduled.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. And a couple of comments have come in also about, so what about the employees then that say, okay, I don't want to come back to work, so I just won't get vaccinated so I can continue to work from home. Again, they could terminate those people if they want to, right?
Well, they could. I think it'll factor in. It's maybe not that different from the person who says, you know, I'm too frightened to come back to work. I don't want to be near my colleagues or customers or whatever. I'm terrified of the pandemic. So I want to remain remote. We're maybe not there yet, but I think that's a fair thing for us to be considering going forward, because at some point we are bringing people back, and these are fair questions. I think, you know, some people may try and game the system and say, you know, I really like working at home. And I don't care if I'm the only one working at home. And then, we do not have a legal obligation to accommodate someone by working from home in the absence of a disability. But we do have the issue of employee morale, and we do have the issue of how effective are you working from home? We don't want to lose people because our competitor's going to let them work from home. But it's a morale issue all the way around. Some people really want to get back to work. Others really don't. Is it a perk to be able to work from home? Maybe if you're effective. Let's go to the next slide because I think that's going to touch on this very question. The EEOC, the magic words here are creative and flexible. Isn't that what we've all been doing for the last year? Creative and flexible. So
Exactly.
this is what the EEOC is telling us about remote work. You need to be, they're saying employers and employees should be creative and flexible about what can be done when an employee needs a reasonable accommodation for telework from home. So in Maine, at least, we've had this case called State of Maine versus Dvorak. And I looked it up yesterday because I couldn't remember when the decision was issued. It was issued in I think, 2001. And the essence of that decision, it involved a state employee with a disability. I believe he was a supervisor for unemployment claims. And because of his disability, he wanted to work from home. And the state wouldn't let him because they felt you're a supervisor, you need to be with your team and working with them. And so he brought a disability discrimination claim, and he eventually lost it. And so for years, we've relied on that decision to say that, of course, you need to be at work to be able to interact with people. Remote work is not the rule, and it's a rare exception. And generally, the need to interact with your coworkers, particularly for a supervisor, is so great that we're not going to let this case proceed. And so,
Michael, can you repeat the name? I'm sorry, can you repeat the name of that case? We've had a request from the audience. What case was that you're citing?
It's Dvorak. It's Kvorjak. 20 years ago, 2001, in fact.
Oh, wow.
So Dvorak was the supervisor. So I've used that case for years when I've been defending these cases to talk about how telework is not a right and how it's usually not even going to be a reasonable accommodation. But I think that we can toss that case out the window now. I don't think those rules apply anymore. It may still not be the best way to get work done, but it's pretty hard for us as employers to say we can't have anybody working remotely, at least in a lot of industries. And what we'll look at is how has it worked this past year? Now, it's different, and that's why we have to be creative and flexible, right, Rhoda? We got to be creative and flexible because some people are really effective working from home, and some are really not. And I think it's probably harder for us as managers and supervisors to always know if people aren't physically in sight, how productive they are. The metrics are tougher, I think, for judging the effectiveness and efficiency of employees who are remote. Some are really motivated and they're going to do great regardless.
Absolutely, no question. All leaders during this last year that have a remote workforce have had to learn how to lead effectively remotely if they didn't before, and stay in touch with their teams. So those are evolving skills that we're building into programs and learnings for our leaders, as well as how to effectively lead remotely. And people have had to do that for years. That were like divisional or regional managers that had locations throughout the country, right? So it's a skill set that is being highly valued now.
Oh, absolutely. And so our other bullet question here is, does a strong workplace culture require in-person work? Well, maybe, but we have to be creative and flexible when we try and figure out if that's the case. certainly what we have missed in the past year is the sort of spontaneous sort of bumping into people in the hallway, catching up with them, whether it be just a social interaction to find out how the baby is, or what about that such and such project that we talked about a couple weeks ago. Those kinds of interactions have fallen apart. And in that same Bill Gates interview, I recall him saying that he found meeting remotely to be very effective and very efficient. But he said what he was missing is that he really hadn't made any new friends in the past year. And I think, for many of us, how we interact with people has changed, and in some ways we've been missing out, and in other ways we've been more efficient. So I think this is a critical question for every organization to answer. Does a strong workplace culture require in-person work? Mm-hmm. And if so, how much? And that may be another tough question. What is the right amount? People say they want to work 4 days or 1 day or whatever. How are we going to work that? And how is that going to impact our workplace? Do we need as much space? I think the commercial real estate industry is certainly in a state of flux right now, as one wonders, what's the lease space that you need? How are your workstations going to be effective? One of our questions I see is, have we heard of fully vaccinated employees are still required to do a 14-day quarantine when they go out of state? I think the state CDC changed that. I'm not positive. I thought they lowered the quarantine requirements.
Yeah,
I don't think they eliminated it, but I think they shortened it for vaccinated employees. Mm-hmm. Let's go on to our next slide. So Rhoda, you've already touched on a lot of these with your questions. And this is sort of what we were hoping we were going to be ready to do. I suspect it's still a little early to implement these, but it's not too early to be thinking about them. That is, at some point, we're going to get the, not necessarily all clear, but we're going to get the more clear signal, and we'll be bringing people back more than now. And so we should be thinking in terms of what is our policy going to look like once we're back. And so I think the biggest one to me is, what's your policy on working from home? I mean, the rules during a pandemic have to be different than they are during regular times. But how have they impacted that? I think you're going to need to have some sort of criteria for how you will allow people to work from home. I think we all have to at least consider it, even if you decide eventually we're just not going to do it. It doesn't work for us. I have some clients for whom it does not work, and their team just functions so much better if they're all there together. And they happen to have a space where they can do that. And I don't think your policy on working from home needs to be at all what it is right now. But I do think that this is something you need to be thinking about. What is our policy going to look like going forward? And one of the ways I think to prepare for that would be to survey your employees, get a good handle on what your employees' preferences are, and also develop some kind of metrics that work for your business, creatively and flexibly, of course. How effective are people working from home? What do they miss out by not being at the workplace or in the office? So I think that's really, really important, because to me, that's going to be the biggest change, that it has worked well for some people and not so well for others. I think another policy is, how are you going to communicate in a digital workplace? I mean, if you've already had a digital workplace, then maybe it's not such a bigger change. But to the extent that now you have people working from home or working remotely, you certainly need to be concerned about privacy issues, communication strategies, confidential information. We've had to do things which might be a little bit more risky by having people working from home. We don't want the kids hopping onto the company laptop and playing games. We need to be concerned about data security. And we're always a little bit worried, I'm sure, about what the home security system is in terms of, your Wi-Fi at home. So data security, I think, becomes a real issue. And how effective are your communications digitally if you're just communicating by Zoom or other such platforms? So I think, that is another policy that's been informed by, how we've handled the pandemic. Workplace health and cleanliness operation policies. I think we've learned a lot during the pandemic. And I think we should also be thinking that, we call this a once in a century event. But I think we'd probably be foolish to think that it's going to be another century before this happens again. I think, going forward, we're certainly going to be thinking of the workplace conditions that we've been living with now. There'll be more and more attention to clean workplaces. Again, the hand sanitizers, posters regarding hygiene practices, and perhaps the spacing of how we keep people at work. That obviously is a part of your operation. I mean, no matter how much we yearn for the way things were before the pandemic, I think it's difficult and maybe naive for us to think that we're going to go back to the way it all was.
Agreed.
And then the final policy is including infectious disease preparedness. Many of us have had plans for what happens to our business in the case of a natural disaster, cyber attacks, workplace violence. We've been focusing on these issues for years, probably a whole lot less on infectious disease preparedness. But obviously that has to move to the forefront now. And when we're doing our business continuity plans, that has to be part of the planning going forward.
Yes, I mean, that's one of the things that we've been advising, is to really carefully evaluate what over the past year and a half, year and a quarter has worked well, what has not, keeping good records and notes about it, and being prepared, using it as your guide for the next time something like this does occur, so that you know how to more quickly adapt than everyone had to, even though we really literally had to adapt over a weekend in March a year ago. It's right. To your point, it will happen again. So use the lessons learned in your own environment and your own employees, your own workers, in terms of what worked, what didn't, and what do we have to do differently next time. So we have about 5 minutes left now, Michael. Is there, and let me see, there's a question about, let's see, the CDC had given 90 days, so they keep updating traveling after the vaccine. So we have, if you get the vaccine, have had the second shot, or 2 to 3 weeks out from the second shot, you'd be good to travel for 90 days without having to quarantine. I don't think we have clarity on that right now, do we?
I don't think we have to. I think they've talked about 90 days as they're comfortable that you're safe for 90 days, but we're not really sure. I mean, one of the problems with a vaccine that's been prepared this quickly is that normally these take 10 years, and we don't have the benefit of the time involved in all that research.
After effects.
Right.
How efficacious it is over time, right? How long term it is.
Right.
And then the different mutants, and that's how come we've been getting annual flu vaccines every year for years and years now, and that will probably continue, but it will continue a bit differently with the impact of the COVID.
Right. Well, we certainly recommend that everybody keep track with the CDC and the state CDC updates. OSHA and the EEOC are going to continue to weigh in, although I think OSHA is going to keep telling us basically be careful out there, and the EEOC is going to tell us to be creative and flexible. You know, I don't think either one of those agencies is dropping the hammer on employers. I think, you know, they've been pretty light-handed, and I think they appreciate how difficult it is to manage a workforce in these times, and hopefully they'll stay that way. And hopefully the science will be able to give us more and more information so that we can more comfortably bring people back. I do think we're going to be looking at a lot more news about vaccinations in the short and immediate term, maybe even the long term, but I think the next few weeks we're going to be learning a lot more about how states are prioritizing who gets the vaccine. We had some controversy in Maine. Different states are doing it different ways, but there certainly is reason for hope that we're going to have a significant portion of our population vaccinated in the next 2 to 4 months.
Absolutely, that's the hope. And any closing comments, Michael, that you would like to make? Because we're a couple minutes out. I don't. Oh, and there's a question: is when surveying, can we survey employees when they return to work to ask them if they are vaccinated or plan on getting vaccinated?
If you're not mandating it, then I think it may lead to privacy questions that we don't want to get into.
Mm.
You can encourage it, but
Right.
Unless we've decided that it is an essential element of returning to work, and it may be in some healthcare settings, but I'm guessing in most office settings, it's probably not.
I mean, if employees that go out to customer sites, you know, people that go to customer sites and interact with customers, like installers, repair people, perhaps.
You know, still, I'm not sure it's an essential function, and to date, we don't really know if it's transmissible or not. The disease is transmissible from someone who has been vaccinated. We know they may be safe, but we're not sure if they're unsafe to others. So there's still a whole lot that we don't know, and I think that's one of the downsides of starting to ask stuff. We're not really sure what we're going to do with the information, and I think, you know, that's the caveat here. You want to know, why are you asking it, and what does it really mean? And unless we really know that, maybe we don't want to start making those inquiries.
Mm-hmm. And to your point at the beginning of this hour, where you talked about, when we talked about this webinar last December, we thought we'd have a lot more clarity on many of these areas by now, because we're impatient as human beings, and we feel we want to get answers right away. We want to know within a week, you know, what's working, what's not. Just like a year ago, March, we thought, oh, we'd only be shut down for a couple of weeks or so, and then we'd all go back to normal, whatever that was, right?
That's right.
And here we are a year later, still wondering what's going to happen. We have some clarity, because we do have vaccinations, to your point, that are beginning to spread, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions that will take time to really kind of ferret out, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let's see, any other last minute questions? We talked about still people going on vaccination, like going on vacation with discretionary travel, that kind of thing, you know, etc. Well, what we'll do, because we've reached the end of the hour, is we'll take a look at all the questions that came in. If there are any that we did not answer, we'll be sure to send answers out to all the participants, as well as this webinar has been recorded, so we'll be sending out how to access the recorded webinar as well today. And Michael, I can't thank you enough for talking with us today and answering these questions, because they are difficult, and you've had to be a little bit of a prognosticator for us here in terms of what you think will happen. And I think you've done a great job of helping illuminate us. So thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to everyone in the audience as well.
My pleasure.
Okay, have a great day, everyone.